Hello and welcome to another TLDR Explains video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the controversial Corona bonds and whether this issue might force Italy out of the European Union. Before we dive in, you might already know that we make a whole bunch of enamel pin badges based on our countries with shoes designs. And, well, we have quite a lot of them, covering most EU countries, including Italy. Check out all of the designs on our store. You can find it linked in the description below. As you probably know, Italy has been one of the hardest hit EU country by the coronavirus, with over 1,800 cases and about 25,000 deaths. The crisis has put a strain on EU solidarity, and recent polling suggests that the Italian public might have had enough. Italy has always had relatively high levels of latent Euroscepticism, with the most recent European Parliament polling in late 2019 finding that only 37% of Italians considered the EU a good thing, and 17% considered it a bad thing. The most negative sentiment in the EU after the UK, which has obviously since left. But historically, when the Italian public have been polled about actually leaving the EU, not just whether it's a good or bad thing, no more than 30% of Italians say they want Italy to actually leave. However, a poll conducted recently, on April 10th, found that with the don't knows excluded, a staggering 49% of Italians want to leave the EU. These are similar numbers to the pre-Brexit polling that took place in the UK. Given that the last poll on the topic, in late 2018, found that only 29% of Italians wanted to leave, this represents a swing of about 20% in favour of an Italexit. If there was any doubt that this swing was coronavirus related, a poll conducted on the 13th of March found that 88% of Italians feel that Europe is failing to support Italy during the crisis, while only 4% believe that it's doing enough. And 67% of Italians regard EU membership as a disadvantage, up from 47% in November 2018. So why is this? Well, there are perhaps three coronavirus related reasons. The first is about medical supplies. In early March, when the coronavirus was taking off in Italy, Italian authorities begged Europe for more medical supplies. In response, Germany and France placed export bans on their medical supplies, and the only country to supply any medical supplies bilaterally in mid-March was China, who supplied Italy with 31 tons of medical equipment, including ventilators and a team of doctors. While it's worth noting that the German and French export bans have since been lifted, it was too little too late. The second issue is about the European Central Bank, or ECB. As Italy has kept borrowing money to handle the crisis, it's seen its borrowing rates increase. To give some context, because the Italian economy isn't in great shape and has a relatively high debt to GDP ratio, when Italy wants to borrow money, investors demand higher interest rates than they might offer other European countries. This means that Italy has to pay more than, say, Germany to borrow money from the markets. Obviously, the more money that Italy borrows, the more investors worry, and so the more that borrowing rates go up. Italy was, and still is, acutely worried about this situation. A sort of solution would be for the European Central Bank to buy some of Italy's bonds, to essentially help it borrow money and to keep borrowing rates down. We're not going to go too much into all of the details because we're not economists and it's way too complicated. But on March 11th, the president of the ECB said that it wasn't the bank's job to close spreads, essentially saying that the ECB didn't plan on making Italy's borrowing as cheap as Germany's. If you're Italian, this might be a cruel thing to hear. It's basically the European Central Bank saying, we know it's not your fault that you need to borrow lots of money to deal with the coronavirus, but sorry, we're not going to help you, it's against our rules. Now the ECB did backtrack on this about a week later, but it was a week too late. To be fair to the ECB though, their new plans are pretty groundbreaking, and if Lagarde hadn't said that thing about closing spreads, Italians would probably be a fair bit happier with the ECB. The programme, called the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Programme, or EPP, means that the European Central Bank will buy some 750 billion euros of sovereign bonds and corporate debt. And the ECB has even lifted what's called the issuer limit, which means that it can buy more than a third of a country's eligible bonds. Normally, the ECB can't do this, as it means that it gets a vote in any debt restructuring, which means that it could be accused of directly funding a national government, which is against the EU's law. So it's certainly a big deal that they've lifted the rule to handle the crisis. The third reason is also financial, and it's about debt mutualisation. Basically, Italy and some other southern European states want other EU states to agree to a new type of financial instrument called the Eurobond or a Corona bond. The idea behind a Eurobond is that instead of Italy issuing bonds itself, the whole of the EU would issue bonds together. This would essentially be Italy borrowing German credibility to borrow at cheaper rates. Obviously, this would probably also mean that Germany couldn't get the same great rates as usual, but according to its supporters, this is a crisis after all. These new bonds wouldn't become the new norm, they could just be issued over the coronavirus crisis. Anyway, Germany and the Netherlands especially have been very anti-corona bonds for a couple of reasons. The obvious one is that it would likely increase their borrowing rates. But another reason is that it's also technically against EU law for a member state to be liable for another member state's debt, according to Article 125 of the TFEU, otherwise known as the No Bailout Clause. It's also because Germany and the Netherlands worry that this is a sort of slippery slope, and that Italy and other Eurozone countries, which run big budget deficits, could always end up relying on their more financially responsible neighbours. It's worth noting here that coronavirus bonds aren't actually a completely new idea, because a similar thing happened after the 1973 oil crisis, when the EU started issuing the EU Community Bond, which was guaranteed by the EU budget. Anyway, EU finance ministers have been having regular phone calls to try and sort out some form of compromise, and on April 9th, they agreed to something. 28 billion euros in extra spending across the Eurozone, and 100 billion euros in loans to national social security programmes, as more people across the continent start applying for support as unemployment rates go up. However, they did refuse to agree any form of corona bond, and instead told Italy and others to borrow from the European Stability Mechanism, or ESM. The ESM is Europe's bailout fund, with about £410 billion in it to lend. However, usually, if you want to borrow from the ESM, you have to agree to a load of austerity measures to bring your finances back up to scratch, much like Greece was required to do after the financial crash. This time, any borrowing for healthcare expenses will have no strings attached, but there's a limit of 2% of GDP. While this might sound like a good idea, it's not what Italy wanted. The ruling Five-Star Movement, the League, and the centre-left Democratic Party all think that the ESM will undermine national sovereignty, because the EU will eventually force harsh austerity measures on Italy when they realise that the country can't pay it back. The Italian Prime Minister even called it inadequate, and it seems like the Italian public hate the idea. Also, the ESM only really kicks the can down the road. It's still Italian debt, just with better borrowing rates, which means that it doesn't solve Italy's long-term debt problems. Anyway, that's why some say that Italians are swinging towards Italexit at the moment. We're not saying that it's going to happen or that it's a good idea, because, after all, most Italian debt is denominated in euros, which means that it could be economically crippling. But it's something that the EU should keep an eye on, especially with increasing dissatisfaction from Italians. What do you think about this? Do you think that the coronavirus is causing difficulties within the EU and breaking apart EU unity? Do you think that countries like Italy could end up leaving because of the crisis? And do you think that Europe's doing enough to assist struggling nations? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments below. You can also get involved in the conversation over on Discord. You might already know that we have a Discord server where over 3,000 TLDR fans meet and discuss a variety of topics from a variety of perspectives. What you might not know is that we're also hosting daily debates on the server. Every week we post a list of the topics on our social media accounts and on Discord, and by the looks of things, we have a busy week ahead. Check out the server, join the debates, and have your say by clicking the link in the description. Also, as I just alluded to, you can find us across all social networks and get bonus content by searching for TLDR News. You can also subscribe to the channel for more updates and hit the bell icon to be notified whenever we post. Special thanks to our Patreon backers for making videos like this one possible.